Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Understanding the Bible from the Arnot Gospel Hall. We're looking at the parables of Jesus, and we're off to a special occasion this time. This is an intriguing one, as Jesus says it represents the kingdom of heaven. Come one, come all, we're off to the marriage feast of Matthew 22. There's nothing quite like a wedding for a bit of controversy, and this parable that Jesus told had plenty of it. Now, before we start, as is normally the case in parables, there are characters in this story that represent different types of people. See if you can tell who each character is meant to be, and more importantly, can you identify yourself in it? Our parable begins with a king who is in the happy situation of celebrating the marriage of his son. As would be the case even today, a wedding feast is prepared and guests are invited. Now, you or I, when we send out an invitation to a wedding, would hopefully see plenty of responses, not least if it was for the royal family. Sadly, on this occasion that isn't the case, so the king sends out his servants to call those that were invited, but again they wouldn't come. He sends out the servants once more to those who were invited, telling them that everything is prepared. The oxen, the calves have been slaughtered and prepared, and everything is ready. Still, no attention is paid to the servants. Some would-be guests wander off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seize the servants and kill them. Now, just stop there a minute and think about what happened. We don't really know any of the background of the relationship between the people and the king, but I would guess that if a king is inviting you to celebrate with him, then he must have been a pretty good king. The people obviously thought otherwise if they are willing to kill the king's own servants. As you can imagine, the king was furious and sent his troops to destroy those that had murdered his servants. When all of this is over, the king is still faced with a problem. The wedding feast is ready, but those that were invited initially are clearly not worthy. However, the king has a plan. He sends out more servants to the roads of the city and told them to invite everyone that they found on their way. Now, as is the case with any city, it's made up of those that we would see as good people and bad people. Nevertheless, they were all invited regardless. They came, and the wedding hall was filled with guests to celebrate the marriage of the king's son. A great place to stop and have a happy ending, you might think, but Jesus has one more curveball for us. As the king comes in and looks around at the guests who are there, he spots a man who isn't wearing any wedding garment. Now, you know what it's like for a wedding. You go in your best suit, a new dress, or if you're Scottish like me, a kilt. But for some reason, this man wasn't dressed appropriately for the wedding. The king goes up to him and asks how he managed to get in without a wedding garment. Well, the man was speechless, and we'll discover later just why that was. The king once again calls his servants and tells them to tie him up and throw him outside into the darkness. The parable wraps up with the king saying to his servants that many have been called, but few have been chosen. Okay, there's the story. Did you spot all the different characters and who they represent? It's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? This benevolent and generous king calling everyone for a feast suddenly turns around and throws a man out for not wearing the right clothes. Let's start with the king. Who do you think he represents? Well, in this parable he represents God, or more specifically, God the Father, with the Son being Jesus himself. Now, the imagery of Jesus as the bridegroom and a coming wedding is not an unusual one. It's an extremely important one in the Bible, and one we'll come back to later. Let's turn our attention to the people who were invited initially to the feast. These people represent the Jewish nation, and this would not have been lost on the Jews gathered around him at the time. The wedding list had been prepared well in advance, and indeed the Jewish nation was a people picked out especially to be God's people and enjoy his eternal blessing through the Messiah that would be sent. The imagery of people rejecting the invitation would be a direct accusation from Jesus that the Jews have and would reject him. You'll notice, however, that he gives them another chance, and God, in his rich mercy, has given people chance after chance to enter into his full blessing. We see it time and time again in the Old Testament, how the Jews would reject God. There would be a time of judgment, and then they would return again, only for the whole cycle to repeat itself again. Finally, the invitation goes out to all to come. Now, this is a really important point to understand, and one that is absolutely crucial for us. What had initially been a really narrow invitation to a select few suddenly becomes a wider invitation to everyone. It's the same with what God is offering us. What started as a promise for the Jewish people, he is offering to every tribe and nation on the planet. He's offering you eternal salvation and a home in heaven. Do you remember that I made specific mention that both the good and the bad were not only invited, but they accepted the invitation to the celebration? What is obvious from this passage is that there was nothing about the second lot of people that had previously endeared them to the king. Otherwise, they would have been in with the first set of invitations. What is important here is the king's invitation and the acceptance of the people, not through their own goodness, but through the grace of the king. Let's address the elephant in the room now, the man who wasn't dressed properly. Now, if you've been to a church in the past, or even seen people walking into a church building, I imagine you've seen them fairly well dressed and in all their finery. Let me be absolutely clear, this is not what is being talked about here. If you want to come along to the Arnot Gospel Hall or any church, then go. Don't worry about what you're wearing, we certainly don't care. You'll be welcomed regardless. You see, before we were saved and had sin in our life, it was like we had filthy rags on. Yet Jesus still welcomed us with open arms. So what's going on here? To understand what this means, I need to give you a little bit more information. And if you remember, the servants went out into the city and invited people to come along. Now, the feast was ready, so it's highly likely that the people just came as they were dressed at the time. But what was often the practice of the time was for wedding garments to be given to the guests for them to wear. You see, everything would have been prepared for and everything was ready for the guests. All they had to do was show up and put on those garments. So now maybe you understand why the man was speechless. What he had done was deliberately reject what had been prepared for him by the king. Whilst it's nice to be invited to a wedding and no doubt you'll enjoy going to them, there is a certain order to the way things are done. What in effect the man had done was to say, I'll come to your feast, but I'm doing it my way. Therein lies the reason for the king's anger. He had prepared everything, nothing had been forgotten, but one man wanted his own way. That's like you and I when it comes to heaven. Very few of us would say that we don't want to go to heaven when we die, but very few of us will do what's being asked of us. So what is being asked of us? Do we need to put on our nice clothes and head along to church? Well, no. What we need to do is first accept God's invitation. To do that, we need to admit that we're sinners and not worthy of a place in heaven. Then we need to believe that Jesus is God's only Son and that he died for us. Finally, we need to confess that Jesus is Lord and ask him to save us from our sins. That's what we mean about getting saved. The Bible tells us that once we're saved, we're washed clean from our sin. All our garments are like new and whiter than the snow. But saved from what? The marriage feast looks forward to a time when we will be in heaven. Christ will have come back again to the earth and taken all those who believe in him to be with him. That collective group of believers, the church, will be presented like a bride to a bridegroom and we will be with them forever. For those who don't, they'll be like the man who rejected what was offered. You'll be cast into outer darkness, a terrible place called hell that is the complete opposite of everything that heaven is. That's what we're being saved from, eternal judgment. So whichever characters do you think you are? Are you in the first lot that rejected the invitation, or are you going to be in the second lot that accepted? Will you put on those new clothes of righteousness that only God can provide through what his Son did on the cross of Calvary? Let today be the day when you accept that invitation and secure your place in heaven. And you'll be able to look forward to a heavenly feast that will come in the future as this world finally passes away.